virgin giant rancher waited for his mail-order bride. But when an obese teen arrived, the church bell tolls as a towering rancher waits at the depot, his heart pounding with hope. The train doors creak open, but instead of the bride he prayed for, a frightened, overweight girl steps onto the platform. Laughter cuts through the dust. Men whisper, women scoff. Shame burns hotter than the summer sun. But when a gambler claims the girl as his property, the rancher makes a choice that shocks the whole town. Now, whispers turn to open war. A crooked judge with papers in hand, a gambler with eyes like a wolf, and a girl who believes she's nothing but a burden. Yet hidden in her trembling voice is a strength no one saw coming. The rancher's faith, the girl's courage, and the law's corruption are about to collide in a courtroom where one word could destroy or redeem them both. Will this lonely giant find the family he's prayed for, or will the weight of gossip and greed crush them before love ever has a chance to take root? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of Colorado's Silver Creek Depot as Caleb Rourke shifted his weight from one boot to another. His freshly brushed coat felt stiff and confining compared to his usual ranch wear, and his large hands kept straying to touch the small Bible in his pocket for reassurance. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, he towered over the handful of townspeople gathering for the train's arrival. The station master's clock showed 4:45 when the first distant whistle echoed through the valley. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs as black smoke appeared on the horizon. The letters in his pocket, exchanged over 6 months with a supposedly mature Christian widow named Millie May, had given him hope for an end to his solitude. Now that hope made his palms sweat. The locomotive's brakes squealed against the iron rails as it pulled into the station, belching steam that swirled around the platform. Caleb straightened his shoulders, scanning the faces of passengers stepping down. His breath caught when a girl, barely more than a child, descended awkwardly from the passenger car, struggling with a worn carpet bag. She was short and notably plump, her ill-fitting dress straining at the seams. Her round face flushed deep red as she stumbled slightly on the platform. Behind Caleb, several onlookers snickered, and his jaw clenched at their cruelty. "That's her," someone whispered too loudly. "Ain't she a bit young for the virgin giant?" More laughter rippled through the crowd. The girl's eyes darted around fearfully until they found Caleb. She clutched her bag tighter, her knuckles white. "Mr. Rourke?" Her voice quavered. "I'm Millie May." Before Caleb could respond, a sharp whistle cut through the air. He turned to see Jonas Pike, a local gambler, lounging against a post. Pike's eyes raked over Millie May's figure as he leaned toward Judge Tilton, who stood nearby in his typical black suit. "Now there's an easy claim," Pike muttered to the judge, just loud enough to carry. "Desperate enough to say yes to anything, I'd wager." The judge's wheezy laugh made Caleb's blood boil. He stepped forward, deliberately placing himself between Millie and their predatory gazes. "Miss May," he said softly, reaching for her bag. "Please, allow me." Up close, he could see she was trembling. Tears brightened her brown eyes as she relinquished the carpet bag. "Mr. Rourke," she whispered, "I need to tell you something right away. I wasn't honest in my letters." Her voice caught. "I'm only 17, not 25, and I know I'm much heavier than that photograph I sent. It was taken when I was younger, before—" She trailed off, unable to meet his gaze. Caleb felt the shock of her words like a physical blow. 17. Lord have mercy. He had expected a mature widow, someone with experience and wisdom to share his life. Instead, here stood a frightened child who had clearly known her share of hurt. More townspeople had gathered, drawn by the spectacle. Their whispers and laughs felt like wasps stinging the air. Caleb saw Millie's shoulders hunch inward, trying to make herself smaller under their scrutiny. The Bible pressed against his heart through his coat pocket. What would the Good Shepherd do with a lost lamb? The answer came clear as morning light. "If God sent you here," he said quietly, "you'll not be left alone." He offered his arm, the way his father had taught him a gentleman should. "My wagon's this way, Miss May." Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks, but she placed her hand on his arm. The touch was light as a butterfly. Together they walked past the gawking crowd, past Pike's predatory smirk and Judge Tilton's disapproving scowl. Caleb's wagon waited at the hitching post, the team of bay horses stamping impatiently. He helped Millie up onto the high seat, noting how she struggled to climb with dignity in her tight dress. The worn carpet bag, clearly containing everything she owned in the world, he tucked carefully behind the seat. As he climbed up beside her, the setting sun painted the western sky in sheets of purple and gold. A cool evening breeze carried the scent of sage and prairie grass. Behind them, the town's mockery faded like the dying day. Millie sat rigid beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I understand if you want to send me back," she said in a small voice. "I know this isn't what you expected." Caleb clicked to the horses and guided them onto the rutted road leading north. "The good Lord often works in unexpected ways, Miss May." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "We've got about an hour's ride to the ranch. Are you warm enough?" She nodded, though he noticed her shiver as darkness began creeping across the land. Without a word, he shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture seemed to break something loose inside her. "I was so scared," she whispered. "When Mama died last year, the orphanage said I had to leave when I turned 18. That was last week. I didn't know what else to do." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry I lied. I just needed somewhere to go." Caleb's heart ached at the raw need in her voice. He thought of his own loneliness these past years, rattling around the big ranch house since his parents' passing. Perhaps the Lord's plan was wiser than either of them knew. "Well," he said gently, "you've got somewhere now. We'll figure out the rest as we go along." The wagon rolled on through the gathering dusk, leaving the jeers and judgment of Silver Creek behind. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also possibility, and the first fragile seeds of hope. The wagon wheels creaked steadily along the rutted trail as darkness settled over the Colorado territory. Millie May huddled deeper into Caleb's oversized coat, a carpet bag clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. Every few minutes, she stole glances at the giant rancher beside her, waiting for him to turn the wagon around and take her back to town. The moon rose, casting silver light across the prairie grass. Wind whispered through the sage, carrying the lonely cry of a distant coyote. Millie shivered, though not from cold. "Mr. Rourke," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the horse's hoofbeats. "I should explain about the orphanage." Caleb's profile remained fixed on the trail ahead, but he nodded slightly, encouraging her to continue. "After Mama died last year, I had nowhere else to go." Millie's fingers twisted in the rough fabric of her bag. "The overseer, Mrs. Blackwood, she made me work in the kitchen from dawn to dusk, said I had to earn my keep on account of..." Her voice caught. "On account of eating more than the other girls." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "When I turned 18 last week, Mrs. Blackwood said they couldn't keep feeding me anymore." Tears stung Millie's eyes as the memory surfaced. She'd already arranged everything with the mail order agency. Said it was that or the streets. A sob escaped before she could catch it. "I just wanted somewhere to belong, somewhere I wouldn't be a burden." The wagon rolled on through the darkness. Caleb's massive hands gripped the reins so hard his knuckles showed white in the moonlight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "No child of God is a burden." After another mile of silence, lights appeared in the distance. As they drew closer, Millie made out the shape of a ranch house silhouetted against the star-filled sky. A barn loomed nearby, and a corral fence stretched into the darkness. Caleb guided the wagon into the yard and brought the team to a halt. "Welcome to Rourke Ranch," he said quietly, helping Millie down from the high seat. Her legs trembled from the long ride as her feet touched earth. The house stood dark and quiet. Caleb carried her bag to the porch, then opened the door with a key from his pocket. The hinges creaked, revealing a tidy but sparse main room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple furniture cast long shadows in the moonlight, streaming through the windows. "Wait here," Caleb said, disappearing into the darkness. Millie stood frozen by the door, still wrapped in his coat, until a match flared. Caleb moved around the room, lighting an oil lamp and kneeling to build a fire. Soon, warm light filled the space, pushing back the shadows. "Sit." He gestured to a chair near the hearth. "I'll fix us something to eat." Millie sank into the offered seat, watching as Caleb moved efficiently around the kitchen area. Soon he set a simple meal before her, bread, cheese, and cold meat from his pantry. Her stomach growled at the sight, reminding her she hadn't eaten since early morning. "Thank you," she whispered, taking small, careful bites despite her hunger. The orphanage habit of rationing food was hard to break, but Caleb nodded toward the plate, encouraging her to eat her fill. As the fire crackled and warmth slowly seeped into her bones, Caleb cleared his throat. "Your papers from the agency," he said. "Do you have them?" Millie's hands shook slightly as she opened her carpet bag. She withdrew a sealed envelope, bearing the marriage broker's official stamp, and handed it across the table. Caleb took it, but didn't break the seal. Instead, he studied the envelope for a long moment before setting it aside on the mantel. "We'll deal with that later," he said, his deep voice gentle but firm. "For tonight, you need rest." He rose and retrieved a lamp, gesturing for her to follow. They climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, where he pointed out a small bedroom. "This was my sister Sarah's room before she married and moved east. There's clean linens in the chest." Millie stepped into the room, noting the simple bed and faded quilt. A window looked out over the moonlit prairie. It was more space than she'd had to herself in over a year. Caleb lingered in the doorway, his massive frame nearly filling it. "Miss May," he said carefully, "you're safe here. I give you my word on that." He paused, choosing his next words with care. "But marriage, that's not what I promised, not to someone so young. We'll need to sort this out proper like, in God's good time." Millie nodded, relief and uncertainty warring in her chest. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke," she whispered, "for everything." He touched the brim of his hat and withdrew, his boot falls heavy on the stairs. Millie closed the door and sank onto the bed, still wrapped in his coat. The events of the day crashed over her like a wave. The terrifying train journey, the cruel laughter at the station, and now this unexpected sanctuary. She sent up a prayer of confused gratitude, though she couldn't help wondering what God's plan could be. Down in the main room, Caleb sat before the dying fire, the unopened envelope weighing heavy on his mind. He'd prayed for a wife, for an end to his solitude, but the Lord had sent him something entirely different, a lost child in need of protection. He bowed his head, asking for guidance he wasn't sure he deserved. In their separate rooms, both lay awake long into the night, troubled by the uncertainty of their situation and wondering what purpose the Almighty could have in bringing them together this way. The prairie wind whispered around the house, carrying no answers, while the sealed envelope waited on the mantel like a question neither was ready to face. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in streaks of pink and gold as Caleb Rourke's axe bit deep into another log. His powerful shoulders flexed with each swing, splitting wood with methodical precision. The morning air carried the sharp scent of fresh-cut pine and the metallic ring of steel striking true. The creak of the farmhouse door drew his attention. Millie May stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. She watched his work with uncertain eyes, shifting from foot to foot as if wanting to help, but unsure of her welcome. Caleb paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a massive forearm. "Morning, Miss May." "Good morning, Mr. Rourke." Millie's voice was soft but determined. Might I help with something?" He considered her request, noting how her hands twisted in her shawl. "Cow needs milking," he said finally. "You ever done that before?" Millie shook her head, her cheeks coloring. "But I learn quick if you'll show me." Caleb nodded and set his axe aside. They walked together to the barn, where a gentle brown cow waited in her stall. Millie approached cautiously, eyeing the large animal with a mix of fascination and nervousness. "This here's Bessie," Caleb said, setting down the milk pail. "She's patient with new folks." He demonstrated the proper technique, his large hands somehow gentle on the cow's udder. "Like this, see? Firm but careful." Millie settled onto the milking stool, her plump fingers trembling as she tried to copy his movements. The first few attempts yielded nothing but frustrated sighs. Bessie shifted, causing Millie to jump. "Here," Caleb said quietly. He stepped behind her, his huge hands covering hers to guide her motions. Rhythm's important, like this. Under his instruction, milk finally streamed into the pail. Millie's face lit up with accomplishment, and even Caleb's stern expression softened slightly at her joy. After the milking, they shared a simple breakfast of porridge and fresh milk. The sealed envelope from the marriage agency sat between them on the table like an unwelcome guest. Finally, Caleb reached for it, his expression grave. "Best we know what we're dealing with," he said, breaking the seal. As he read the contents, his face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the prairie. The contract was clear. Millie May was legally named as his bride, the document already witnessed and binding. His massive hands clenched the paper, knuckles white with tension. "Mr. Rourke," Millie's voice quavered. What does it say?" "They've made you my legal wife," he said heavily. "Contract's already binding." He looked up, jaw tight. "That gambler at the station, he paid your fare?" Millie nodded miserably, tears welling in her eyes. Mrs. Blackwood arranged it all. Said he'd sponsored other girls before. She reached for the contract with shaking hands. "Please, tear it up. I never meant to trap you this way." "No." Caleb's voice was firm as he moved the paper from her reach. "Paper don't own people, but neither will I let a wolf take you. That gambler could lay claim if I refuse." "But I've brought nothing but trouble," Millie whispered, tears spilling down her round cheeks. Caleb's response was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Through the window, they saw a stout woman riding up on a sturdy mare. Mrs. Ruth Porter, their nearest neighbor, dismounted with practiced ease despite her age. "Caleb Rourke," she called, marching up to the porch. "A word, if you please." Caleb rose, touching Millie's shoulder gently. "Stay here," he murmured before stepping outside to meet the widow. Through the partially open door, Millie could hear Mrs. Porter's urgent whispers. A child bride, Caleb. The whole town's talking. What were you thinking? Mrs. Porter? Caleb's deep voice remained steady. Things ain't what they seem. The girl needed help. Help is one thing, Mrs. Porter hissed. But to keep her here, unchaperoned, it ain't proper. What's proper ain't always what's right, Caleb replied firmly. She stays under my protection. The conversation continued in lower tones Millie couldn't catch. She sank deeper into her chair, shame burning in her chest. More trouble, more gossip, exactly what she'd feared bringing to this quiet ranch. When Caleb returned inside, his expression was troubled but determined. Millie couldn't meet his eyes. I should go, she whispered. The gossip will only get worse. No. Caleb's voice was gentle but immovable as the mountains. He knelt beside her chair, bringing himself level with her tear-stained face. Listen close, Miss May. You are not trouble. You are under my roof, and that's where you'll stay until we sort this proper. But everyone will think. Let them think. He cut her off. The good Lord knows the truth, and that's enough for me. Fresh tears spilled down Millie's cheeks, but these were different. Tears of gratitude and wonder at finding such unexpected kindness. Caleb stood, awkward in the face of her emotion, and moved to the window. The morning sun caught his profile, strong and steady as he gazed out at his land. The contract lay forgotten on the table between them, its words binding them together in ways neither had expected. Outside, Mrs. Porter's horse kicked up dust as she rode away, no doubt carrying news of the scandal to other neighbors. But inside the farmhouse, a fragile peace held, built on Caleb's quiet strength and Millie's desperate hope for belonging. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright over the Colorado frontier. Caleb Rourke stood beside his wagon, checking the harness straps one final time. His best black coat stretched tight across his broad shoulders, and his freshly polished boots gleamed in the early light. Miss May? He called toward the house. Time we were heading to service. Millie emerged, tugging self-consciously at her dress. The faded blue cotton strained across her plump figure, clearly a garment she'd outgrown months ago. Her cheeks flamed as she approached the wagon, eyes downcast. It's all I have, she whispered. The orphanage never gave us new things. Caleb's expression softened as he offered his hand, helping her climb aboard. The Lord looks at the heart, not the clothing, he said quietly, though his jaw tightened at another reminder of her neglect. The wagon wheels creaked along the dusty road into town. As they approached the white-painted church, Millie's fingers twisted nervously in her lap. Children playing in the yard stopped to stare, their whispers and giggles carrying clearly in the morning air. Look at her dress. That's the mail-order bride? Mama says she's just a child. Caleb's massive hand gripped the reins tighter, but he kept his voice gentle. Pay them no mind, Miss May. Hold your head high. Inside the church, the whispers continued. Caleb led Millie to a pew near the back, but heads turned to watch their progress. Mrs. Porter's disapproving sniff echoed in the quiet space. A group of town ladies huddled together, their fans fluttering as they exchanged meaningful looks. Never thought Caleb Rourke would make such a choice. And him being such a godly man. That poor girl, barely more than a child. Millie shrank deeper into the pew, her face burning. Caleb sat straight-backed beside her, his Bible open on his knee, but his shoulders were tense as granite. The minister's sermon spoke of mercy and judgment, but few seemed to be listening. The undercurrent of gossip continued throughout the service, like wasps buzzing in summer heat. When the final hymn ended, Caleb rose quickly to escort Millie out. They didn't make it to the wagon. The gambler from the train station stepped from behind a hitching post, his fancy vest gleaming with watch chains. Judge Tilton lurked nearby, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Well now, Mr. Rourke," the gambler drawled, blocking their path. "Seems we need to discuss your situation." His eyes raked over Millie, who pressed closer to Caleb's side. "Judge here tells me that contract ain't properly fulfilled without a proper ceremony. Unless you're aiming to marry the girl right quick, law says she belongs to whoever paid her way." Caleb's massive frame went rigid. His hands curled into fists at his sides, each one bigger than the gambler's face. For a moment, the air crackled with tension. "Step aside," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous as summer thunder. The gambler's smile never wavered. Now, no need for violence. Judge will issue the decree tomorrow. Either marry her proper or hand her over. Your choice, giant." Caleb's chest rose with a deep breath. Instead of striking, he placed one huge hand gently on Millie's shoulder, guiding her past the gambler without another word. They climbed into the wagon as townspeople watched and whispered. The ride home was silent, save for the creak of wheels and Millie's occasional sniffles. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, matching the darkness in Caleb's expression. At the ranch, Millie moved mechanically through preparing their simple supper. She set bowls of beans and cornbread on the table, then stood wringing her apron instead of sitting. "Mr. Rourke?" she said finally, voice trembling. "I should go. Your reputation. You're standing in the church. I'm ruining everything." Caleb's palm slammed against the table with such force the bowls jumped. "No!" The word exploded from him like a gunshot. "No girl belongs thrown to dogs, not while I draw breath." Thunder rolled outside, and the first heavy drops of rain pelted the windows. Millie jumped at the sound, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But they're right," she whispered. "I'm nothing but trouble, just a burden. Always have been." The storm intensified, wind rattling the glass panes. Caleb pushed back from the table and knelt in the middle of the kitchen floor. His huge hands clasped together as he bowed his head. "Lord," he prayed aloud, voice rough with emotion, "grant us wisdom in this trial. Show us your path through this valley. Protect this child you've placed in my care, and give me strength to do what's right." Lightning flashed, illuminating the kitchen in stark white. In the following darkness, Millie's soft voice rose, tremulous but sweet. She sang an old hymn, one learned in the orphanage during storms just like this. "Be not afraid, though thunder roar, though lightning flash and tempest pour, the Lord our shelter evermore, our refuge in the storm." Caleb lifted his head, watching her sing. Something shifted in his expression as he truly saw her for the first time. Not just a frightened girl, but a soul of deep courage. Despite shame and mockery, despite years of being unwanted, she still had faith enough to sing in the darkness. The storm raged on, sealing them together in the lamplight. Wind howled around the corners of the house, but inside, a different kind of shelter held firm. Caleb rose from his knees, moving to stir up the fire against the growing chill. Millie continued humming softly as she cleared the table, her voice a counterpoint to the thunder. They remained together in the kitchen's warmth, two souls brought together by Providence and protected now by Caleb's fierce declaration. Outside, rain lashed the windows and lightning split the sky, but within these walls they found themselves bound by something stronger than weather or whispers, the unshakable certainty that here, at least, was sanctuary. Gray clouds hung low over the Colorado frontier, painting the landscape in muted shades. Days stretched into one another like wagon tracks in mud. But something was changing at the Rourke Ranch. The lonely homestead had gained a new rhythm, punctuated by Millie Mae's determined efforts to learn ranch life. Like this. Caleb demonstrated, reaching carefully under a speckled hen. His massive hands looked almost comical as he gently lifted the bird to show Millie the nest beneath. "They get ornery if you startle them." Millie nodded, her round face intent with concentration. When she tried, the hen squawked and fluttered, sending feathers flying. Instead of crying as she might have days ago, Millie giggled, her laugh bright in the dim coop. "Land sakes, she's a fierce one." She brushed feathers from her apron. "I reckon she thinks I'm after more than just eggs." The corner of Caleb's mouth twitched. He'd noticed these moments more lately, how Millie met difficulties with growing humor instead of tears. It stirred something in his chest he wasn't ready to name. In the barn, Caleb showed her how to repair worn leather straps, his calloused fingers guiding hers through the motions of threading needles and pulling tight stitches. Millie's plump hands were clumsy at first, but she worked with quiet determination. "My ma used to say anything worth doing's worth doing right," she said softly, unpicking a crooked stitch to start again. Caleb noticed she mentioned her past more freely now, as if the weight of it was lifting slightly. The riding lessons proved more challenging. Caleb led his gentlest mare from the corral, explaining how to mount bareback. Millie eyed the horse's tall back dubiously. "I ain't never been on a horse before," she admitted. "The orphanage only had one old mule for deliveries." "No time like now to learn," Caleb said, offering his cupped hands as a step. "Ranch wife needs to ride." He caught himself too late. He hadn't meant to imply anything about their future. But Millie was too focused on climbing aboard to notice his slip. After several awkward attempts that left them both red-faced, she finally settled astride the mare, gripping the mane with white-knuckled fingers. "There now?" Caleb soothed, though whether he was speaking to Millie or the horse wasn't clear. "Nice and easy." They spent the afternoon walking circles in the pasture, Millie gradually relaxing her death grip as she found her balance. When she finally managed to guide the mare in a wobbly figure eight, a triumphant smile lit up her whole face. Caleb found himself smiling back before he could catch himself. One evening, as sunset painted the clouds in deep purple, Caleb suggested walking the fence line. Millie agreed eagerly, though the terrain was rough. She puffed and sweated climbing the hills, but never asked to turn back. Caleb slowed his long stride to match her shorter steps, silently impressed by her persistence. "Might be a break in the wire up ahead," he said, pointing to where cattle had been gathering suspiciously. "Need to check it before dark." Millie nodded, still breathing hard. "I can help hold the wire while you mend it if you like." They worked together in the gathering dusk, Millie's small hands steady despite her obvious fatigue. When they finally turned toward home, she paused at the top of a rise, looking back over the shadowed valley. "Sometimes I wonder," she said softly, "if I'll ever be enough. Strong enough, skilled enough, just enough." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching the first stars appear. "A woman's worth ain't weighed in pounds," he finally said, his deep voice gentle in the twilight. "The good book says true beauty comes from within." Millie ducked her head, but Caleb caught the gleam of tears in her eyes. Grateful ones this time, he thought. The next morning brought Mrs. Porter riding up in her buggy, basket over her arm. Despite her earlier disapproval, the widow seemed to have had a change of heart. "Thought I might show you my bread recipe," she announced, sweeping into the kitchen. "Every ranch wife should know how to bake proper bread." Millie spent the morning learning to knead dough, flour dusting her cheeks and hair. Mrs. Porter proved a patient teacher, explaining how the dough should feel and smell when ready for baking. When Caleb came in from the fields, the kitchen was warm with the scent of fresh bread. "It ain't perfect," Millie warned as she set a somewhat lopsided loaf before him. But Mrs. Porter says practice makes better. Caleb broke off a piece, steam rising as he tasted it. Good, he said simply. But Millie beamed as if he'd written poetry about it. The evenings developed their own gentle pattern. After supper, Caleb would read from his Bible by lamplight, his deep voice rolling through familiar passages. Gradually, Millie began adding her voice to the worship, singing hymns in her sweet, clear soprano. The old house seemed to soak up the music like parched earth drinking rain. One night, watching Millie rock in his mother's chair while she mended his shirt, Caleb allowed himself to imagine a future. He saw winter evenings by the fire, spring gardens planted together, children with Millie's gentle spirit and musical laugh. The vision caught him off guard, making his heart race like a startled horse. But duty and uncertainty pulled at him. The town's whispers about his child bride still echoed in his mind. His position as a church elder felt precarious, and his own heart, untested in matters of love, trembled at the thought of such vulnerability. Millie glanced up, catching his troubled gaze. "Penny for your thoughts, Mr. Rourke?" Caleb looked away quickly, suddenly conscious of his staring. "Just thinking on tomorrow's work?" he said gruffly. But long after Millie had gone to bed, he sat alone in the lamplight, wrestling with the growing warmth in his heart and the fears that tried to freeze it. The following week dawned bright but bitter cold as Caleb hitched the wagon for their trip to town. Millie had carefully packed 3 dozen eggs in straw, hoping to trade them at the mercantile for sugar and coffee. Her fingers trembled slightly as she climbed aboard, remembering the whispers from their last visit. "You'll do fine," Caleb said quietly, noticing her nervousness. The wagon wheels creaked as they set off down the rutted road. At the mercantile, Millie gathered her courage and stepped inside, while Caleb saw to some business at the bank. The store bell tinkled as she entered, basket held tight against her chest. Several town children lounged near the penny candy jars, including some she recognized from church. "Look who it is," one boy sneered. "The giant's pet pig." Millie's cheeks burned, but she kept walking toward the counter. Her hands shook as she set down her basket. "Oink oink!" another child called out. "Better watch out, she might eat all the candy." Tears stung Millie's eyes as cruel laughter filled the store. She tried to focus on carefully lifting out her eggs, but her trembling fingers betrayed her. One egg slipped, cracking on the counter. "Clumsy as well as fat," a girl taunted. "No wonder she had to buy herself a husband." The store bell rang again. A shadow fell across the counter as Caleb's massive frame filled the doorway. The children's laughter died in their throats as he stood silent, solid as a mountain. His presence seemed to fill the whole store until even the air grew still. Without a word, he moved to stand beside Millie. His large hand covered hers on the basket, steadying it. The children slunk away one by one, the bell marking their hasty departure. "I'll handle the trading," he said softly. "You wait in the wagon." Millie nodded gratefully, hurrying outside. When Caleb joined her minutes later, she whispered, "Thank you." He simply squeezed her hand before taking up the reins. The ride home was quiet until Caleb unexpectedly broke the silence. "I know something about being different," he said, his deep voice barely audible above the wagon's creak. "Growing up, I was always the biggest kid. The others called me names too: monster, giant, freak." Millie turned to look at him, surprised by this sharing of his past. "One day," he continued, "I got so angry I nearly hurt someone. That's when my pa sat me down and taught me that true strength isn't about size, it's about how you use what God gave you." He glanced at her. "Your heart's bigger than any of their cruel words, Millie May." Tears welled in her eyes again, but different ones this time. The rest of the journey passed in comfortable quiet, their shared understanding deeper than before. The next morning, Caleb woke to the sound of singing. Millie's sweet voice drifted up the stairs, accompanied by the soft swish of a broom. He found her in the kitchen, already dressed and working. "Good morning, Mr. Rourke," she said cheerfully. "Breakfast is almost ready." He noticed his Bible placed carefully on the table, his freshly brushed coat hung by the door, and his boots, usually scattered where he kicked them off, cleaned and lined up neatly. These small touches of care for his daily life struck him deeply. "Much obliged," he managed, touched by her thoughtfulness. The peaceful morning shattered when dark clouds rolled in suddenly from the mountains, bringing bitter wind and snow. Caleb hurried to check the livestock, Millie following with hot coffee in a tin cup. They found trouble in the south pasture. A mare had given birth early, and her foal lay struggling in the growing drifts. Caleb's heart sank. In this weather, the newborn wouldn't last long. "We have to get it to the barn," he shouted over the wind. Without hesitation, Millie waded through knee-deep snow to help. Her skirts grew heavy with ice, but she pressed on. Together, they reached the weakening foal. "I'll lift the front," Caleb directed. "You support the back legs." The wet snow soaked through Millie's boots as she positioned herself. At Caleb's signal, they lifted together. The foal was heavier than expected, and Millie's arms trembled with the strain. But she didn't let go. Step by painful step, they carried the newborn through the storm. Halfway to the barn, Millie stumbled. Caleb couldn't help without dropping the foal. "I'm fine," she gasped, struggling back to her feet. "Keep going." Finally, they reached the barn. They settled the foal in fresh straw as its mother nickered anxiously nearby. Millie helped Caleb rub the little creature dry, working until warmth returned to its limbs. Only when the foal finally nursed did Millie collapse, exhausted. Her dress was soaked through, her face pale with cold and fatigue. Without a word, Caleb scooped her up in his arms. She felt small against his chest, but he knew now that her spirit was anything but. Looking down at her wind-chapped face, Caleb could no longer deny the truth. This girl that fate had delivered to his door was braver than any cruel tongue that mocked her. She had proved it not with words, but with actions born of a caring heart. "Let's get you warm," he murmured, carrying her carefully through the snow toward home. Millie nodded weakly, her head resting trustingly against his shoulder. In that moment, as the storm raged around them, Caleb felt something shift inside his chest, like a key turning in a long, rusted lock. But there would be time to examine those feelings later. For now, his only thought was getting Millie safely inside, where warmth and dry clothes waited. The ranch house glowed with golden warmth as February melted into March. The hearth that had stood cold and empty for so long now crackled with constant fire, tended by Millie's careful hands. The rooms that had echoed with lonely silence now rang with her gentle humming as she moved through her daily tasks. Morning light streamed through freshly washed windows, catching the flour dust that danced in the air as Millie kneaded dough on the kitchen table. The familiar scent of baking bread filled every corner of the house. It was her third batch this week, each one better than the last as her confidence grew under Mrs. Porter's patient teaching. "Mr. Rourke!" she called out the open door, spotting Caleb returning from the barn. "Fresh bread's nearly ready." He ducked his tall frame through the doorway, boots leaving dusty prints on her clean floor. Millie shook her head with mock severity. "Lord have mercy on your serious face," she teased, surprising herself with her boldness. "Anyone would think you were attending a funeral instead of coming in for hot bread and butter." The corner of Caleb's mouth twitched, the closest he usually came to a smile. But Millie had learned to read the warmth in his eyes, even when his expression remained stern. can't help my face," he replied, hanging up his coat. Born with it. "Well, the good Lord must have been feeling mighty solemn that day," Milly said, dimpling as she shaped the dough into loaves. Later that evening, after the chores were done and supper dishes cleared away, they settled into what had become their comfortable routine. Caleb sat in his chair by the fire, Bible open on his knee. Milly worked on mending one of his shirts, her needle flashing in the firelight. The familiar words of Scripture filled the room as Caleb read aloud from Psalms. His deep voice blended with the crackling flames and the soft whisper of Milly's thread-through fabric. Peace settled over them like a warm blanket. When the chapter ended, Caleb fell silent, staring into the fire. Milly glanced up from her mending, sensing something on his mind. "Years ago," he said finally, his voice low, "I prayed for a wife. Not just any wife. One with a brave heart." He met Milly's startled gaze. "Reckon maybe the Lord answered that prayer, just not in the way I expected." Milly's hand stilled in her lap. "Brave," she whispered. "Me? Saw it that day with the foal. See it every day since. Way you face down gossip and cruel words. Way you keep trying even when things are hard." Caleb's eyes were gentle. "That's real courage, Millie May." Tears welled in her eyes, dropping onto the shirt in her lap. "No one," she swallowed hard, "no one's ever wanted me for who I am. Always too big, too clumsy, too much of everything wrong." "Nothing wrong about a caring heart," Caleb said softly. The moment stretched between them, tender as a new leaf in spring. Milly's heart thundered in her chest. Caleb's hand moved as if to reach for hers, but just then the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The spell broke as both jumped at the sound. Milly hastily wiped her eyes, returning to her mending. Caleb cleared his throat and turned back to his Bible. But something had shifted, like ice breaking up on a river after winter's long freeze. Morning dawned clear and cold. Milly was up early as usual, mixing biscuit dough while coffee percolated on the stove. The sudden thunder of hoofbeats in the yard made her jump, spilling flour across the table. Caleb was already at the door, rifle in hand. Through the window, Milly saw young Tommy from the general store, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Mr. Rourke!" Tommy called out, breathless. "Deputies are coming. Got warrants from Judge Tilton." The boy's face was pale with worry. "That gambler, Pike. He's been spreading stories in town. Says you bought yourself a child bride, sir. Judge is sending men to investigate." Milly felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the table edge to steady herself as the room seemed to spin. Everything they'd built here, the peace, the warmth, the growing trust, was about to shatter like ice in spring flood. Caleb stood rigid in the doorway, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with deliberate care, he set the weapon aside. "Much obliged for the warning, Tommy," he said quietly. "Best get on home now." The boy nodded and wheeled his horse, disappearing back down the road in a cloud of dust. Caleb turned to find Milly trembling in the kitchen doorway, her face ashen. "I'll go," she whispered. "Before they come. I never meant to bring such trouble to your door. I'll just take my bag and—" "No!" Caleb's voice was firm. "Running looks like guilt. We've done nothing wrong. But the warrant, the judge, I'll not meet this with bullets," Caleb said, moving to stand before her. "Only truth. Truth is, you came here legal and proper, through the marriage agency. Truth is, I've given you nothing but shelter and respect. Truth is—" He paused, his jaw working. "Truth is, you belong here now." Tears spilled down Milly's cheeks. "They won't believe. Don't matter what they believe. Matters what's right." Caleb's huge hands were gentle as they gripped her shoulders. I promised you wouldn't be alone. Mean to keep that promise." The sound of more horses approaching echoed from the road. Millie's heart hammered against her ribs as Caleb stepped onto the porch to meet whatever was coming. She wanted to run, to hide. But instead, she forced herself to stand straight beside him. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The evening shadows lengthened across the ranch house floor as Millie moved quietly through her room. Her hands trembled as she folded her few dresses, tucking them into the worn carpet bag she'd arrived with just weeks ago. Each item seemed heavier than before, weighted now with memories of the life she'd dared to dream might be hers. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb's boot heels on the wooden floor as he paced the kitchen. The sound made her heart ache. She'd brought nothing but trouble to this good man's door. The least she could do was leave before his reputation was completely destroyed. Millie crept down the hallway, bag in hand. "I have to go," she whispered, her voice catching. "I won't have your good name ruined because of me." Caleb turned from the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the dying light. "Put that bag down, Millie May." His voice was quiet, but carried the unmovable weight of mountains. "But the warrant is no cause for running." He crossed the room in 3 long strides. "You're staying right here where you belong?" "I don't belong anywhere," Millie protested, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Never have. You belong under my protection." Caleb's jaw was set firm. "That's God's truth, and I aim to stand by it." Dawn broke cold and clear the next morning. Millie had barely slept, lying awake listening to the coyotes howl in the distance. She was at the stove fixing breakfast when the sound of approaching horses made her blood run cold. Caleb was already on the porch when 3 deputies rode into the yard. Their badges glinted in the morning sun as they dismounted, spurs jingling against packed earth. "Got a warrant here, Rourke?" The lead deputy announced, pulling a folded paper from his vest. His voice carried across the yard as he read. "By order of Judge Tilton, one Millie May is claimed in breach of contract by Mr. James Pike, who paid her passage and holds prior claim." Prior claim. Caleb's voice cut through the morning air like an axe. A man can't claim a person like cattle. "Law's the law," the deputy replied, though he wouldn't meet Caleb's eyes. "Pike says you're harboring her illegal-like." "Then let's have it proper before the town." Caleb stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the yard. "I demand a public hearing. Let Pike make his claims in the light of day." The deputies exchanged glances. Finally, the leader nodded. 2 days hence, 10 o'clock at the town hall. Judge'll hear both sides." "We'll be there," Caleb said firmly. After the deputies rode away, Caleb sank heavily into a kitchen chair. The strength seemed to drain from his massive frame as he slumped forward, head in his hands. Millie knelt beside him, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I'm scared half to death," she admitted softly, "but I won't let you face this alone." Caleb raised his head, meeting her eyes. Together, they bowed their heads as he began to pray. "Lord, give us strength to stand for what's right. Guide us through this valley of shadows." The next day brought a steady stream of visitors to the ranch. Mrs. Porter arrived first, bringing fresh bread and quiet words of encouragement. "You've found your backbone, girl," she told Millie, squeezing her hand. "Don't you lose it now." But not all came with support. Old Mr. Jenkins from the next ranch over pulled Caleb aside, his weathered face grave. "Best cut her loose, son," he advised. "Ain't worth the trouble she'll bring down on you. Reputation's hard to rebuild out here." "My reputation's between me and the Lord," Caleb answered firmly. "And he knows what's right." As dusk settled over the ranch, Caleb walked his fence line, checking cattle with mechanical precision. His jaw was set hard as granite as he worked, knowing tomorrow would test every principle he lived by. The law might be against them, but he'd learned long ago that man's law didn't always match God's justice. From the kitchen window, Millie watched his tall figure moving through the gathering darkness. Her hands were steady now as she kneaded dough for tomorrow's bread. "No more running," she whispered to herself. "Whatever comes, I'll stand my ground." The words felt strange in her mouth. She'd spent so many years ducking her head, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. But something had changed in these weeks at the ranch. Perhaps it was Caleb's quiet strength, or the dignity he'd shown her. Perhaps it was finding work that made her feel useful, or learning that her size didn't matter half as much as her heart. Whatever the reason, she knew she couldn't run anymore. Tomorrow they would face the judge together, and for the first time in her life, Millie May would stand tall and fight for her place in the world. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the ranch house windows when the sound of wagon wheels caught Millie's attention. She looked up from her mending to see Mrs. Porter's buggy rolling into the yard, the widow driving with unusual haste. "Millie, Caleb," Mrs. Porter called out, her voice carrying unusual excitement. She clutched a leather document case to her chest as she climbed down from her seat. Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his work pants. "Mrs. Porter, what brings you out here in such a hurry?" The widow's round face beamed as she hurried toward the porch. The Lord works in mysterious ways, but sometimes he leaves a paper trail. Inside the kitchen, Mrs. Porter spread several documents across the wooden table. Her fingers trembled with excitement as she pointed to official stamps and signatures. "I wrote to every orphanage in 3 states," she explained, smoothing out a yellowed page. "The Holy Spirit guided me right to it. Millie's true records from St. Agnes Home for Children." Millie leaned forward, her heart pounding. "But what does it mean?" "It means, dear girl, that you turned 18 years old 3 weeks ago, just before you arrived here." Mrs. Porter's eyes sparkled. "You're of legal age. Have been since before you stepped off that train." Millie gasped, pressing her hands to her mouth. "Truly? See here." Mrs. Porter pointed to a birth date clearly printed in careful script. "And here's your admission papers, signed by the priest himself. There's no disputing these records." Caleb studied the documents carefully, his large hands gentle with the fragile papers. "This changes everything for tomorrow." "The Lord provides," Mrs. Porter said firmly. "That gambler and his pet judge can't claim a grown woman against her will, no matter what contract they wave around." Relief flooded through Millie, making her legs weak. She sank into a kitchen chair, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I never even knew my own birthday." Mrs. Porter squeezed her shoulder. "Now you do, and it's come just when you needed it most." After Mrs. Porter left, promising to meet them at the town hall tomorrow, the house grew quiet. Millie and Caleb moved through their evening chores in thoughtful silence, each wrestling with what lay ahead. As night fell, Caleb built up the fire in the main room. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Millie finished washing the supper dishes. When she came to sit in her usual chair by the hearth, she found her hands were shaking. "What if—" she began, then stopped, twisting her apron in her lap. "Speak your mind," Caleb said quietly, adding another log to the fire. "What if they don't believe the papers? What if they laugh at me again?" Her voice grew small. "What if I stand up there and can't find my voice at all?" Caleb settled into his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "Truth needs no fancy words, Millie. Just tell it plain as you live it." "I'm afraid," she whispered. "So am I." His admission surprised her. She looked up to find his eyes serious in the firelight. "Never stood before a court before. Never thought I'd have to defend having kindness in my home. I'm sorry for bringing such trouble." "Stop that!" His voice was firm but gentle. "Shame's got no place here. You tell your truth tomorrow. Stand tall and speak it. I'll be right beside you." Millie nodded, drawing a shaky breath. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her small hand in his large one. His fingers closed carefully around hers, warm and strong. "Lord," Caleb prayed softly, "guide our steps tomorrow. Let truth shine bright as morning. Give us courage to stand firm in your sight." "Amen," Millie whispered. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, fat white flakes drifting past the windows. Soon the whole ranch was wrapped in a hushed blanket of white, as if heaven itself was offering peace before tomorrow's storm. "Best get some sleep," Caleb said finally. "We'll leave at first light." Millie nodded and rose, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from his. At the doorway to her room, she paused. "Thank you, Caleb, for everything." He nodded, his expression gentle in the fading firelight. "Sleep well, Millie May." But Caleb himself did not seek his bed that night. Instead, he stayed in his chair by the fire, watching the flames dance and keeping vigil until dawn. He added logs when needed, his movements quiet so as not to disturb Millie's rest. In the barn, he had already prepared the wagon for tomorrow's journey, checking every strap and wheel. The horses were ready too, their feed measured out for an early morning start. Now all he could do was wait and pray and watch over his household through the quiet hours. The snow continued falling softly outside, gathering thick and white on the windowsills. Caleb's Bible lay open on his knee, though his eyes often strayed to the window, watching the night pass slowly toward dawn. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, peace reigned over the ranch, as pure and clean as the new-fallen snow. Dawn painted the snow-covered hills in shades of pearl and rose as Caleb hitched the horses to the wagon. His breath formed clouds in the frigid morning air while he double-checked every strap and buckle. The fresh snow had stopped falling, but a thick white blanket covered everything in sight, transforming the familiar landscape into something almost sacred. Millie appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her thickest shawl. She had taken extra care with her appearance, wearing her best dress and arranging her hair neatly. Her face was pale, but determination showed in the set of her chin. "The horses are ready," Caleb said softly, offering his arm to help her through the snow. His massive frame blocked the cutting wind as he guided her to the wagon. Millie's boots crunched in the fresh powder as she walked. When they reached the wagon, Caleb lifted her onto the seat as easily as if she were a child, his strong hands steady and sure. He tucked warm blankets around her before climbing up beside her. The wagon wheels creaked as they set out, breaking fresh tracks in the pristine snow. They passed the Peterson place first, where old Mrs. Peterson stood in her doorway, watching them with narrow eyes. Further along, the Mitchell children pointed from their yard, whispering behind mittened hands. Millie's fingers twisted in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. Without a word, Caleb reached over and covered both her small hands with his large one. The warmth and strength of his grip steadied her trembling. "Truth needs no defense," he reminded her quietly, his deep voice barely carrying over the sound of the horses' hooves in the snow. They passed more homesteads as they drew closer to town. At each one, people stopped their morning chores to stare. Some nodded in greeting, but most just watched in silence, their faces showing either concern or poorly hidden eagerness for the drama to come. The courthouse loomed ahead, its wooden steps already crowded with townspeople despite the early hour. Millie's breath caught in her throat at the sight of so many people. It seemed the entire town had turned out to witness the proceedings. Caleb guided the wagon to a stop, helping Millie down with the same gentle care he had shown earlier. As they mounted the courthouse steps, the crowd parted, whispers following in their wake. Inside, the wooden benches were packed with spectators, their winter coats and shawls adding to the stuffy atmosphere. Near the front, the gambler lounged against the rail separating the gallery from the judge's bench. His fancy vest and watch chain gleamed as he smirked at their entrance. Judge Tilton sat behind his elevated desk, his jowls quivering as he shuffled papers with exaggerated importance. Caleb led Millie to the front bench, where Mrs. Porter waited with their documents spread before her. The widow squeezed Millie's hand as they sat down. Judge Tilton banged his gavel, the sharp crack echoing through the packed room. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice dripping with self-importance. "We are here to address the matter of ownership regarding one Millie May, currently residing at the Rourke Ranch." The gambler stepped forward, producing a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Your Honor, I hold here a legal claim. The girl's passage was paid with my money, making her my property until such debt is settled." His oily voice carried to every corner of the room. Millie felt herself shrinking under the weight of all those staring eyes, but Caleb's solid presence beside her helped her sit straight. Judge Tilton peered at the paper through his spectacles, nodding sagely. "Everything appears to be in order. Unless there are any legitimate objections, I object." Caleb's voice thundered through the courthouse as he rose to his full height. Several people gasped at the sight of the giant rancher standing at his full, imposing height. "Millie May is no man's property. She is a free woman, and I demand she be heard." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. Judge Tilton's face reddened. "Now see here, Rourke. The law requires all parties be heard." Caleb insisted, his quiet voice carrying authority that made even the judge pause. "I ask that Millie speak her truth before this court." The judge's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he recovered. "Very well," he said grudgingly. "The girl may speak. Briefly." Millie stood on shaking legs. The room swam before her eyes as she faced the sea of familiar faces, some sympathetic, others hostile, most simply curious about the scandal. She closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her courage. When she opened them again, she found Caleb's steady gaze. He nodded once, encouraging her. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "I was left at St. Agnes Home for Children when I was just a baby," she said, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger with each word. "I never knew my parents. The nuns raised me, working me in the kitchens from the time I could reach the counters." The crowd grew still as she continued, describing the loneliness of orphanage life, the mockery she endured for her size, and how the overseer had pushed her into the mail-order bride system to save on costs. "I did lie in my letters," she admitted, her voice clear now. "I was ashamed of how I looked, afraid no one would want me if they knew the truth. But when I arrived here, Caleb Rourke showed me what true Christian charity means." Her voice filled the wooden hall as she described Caleb's kindness, his protection, how he had offered shelter without demands. "He taught me that worth isn't measured in pounds or dollars," she said firmly. "He showed me that God's love comes in unexpected ways." By now, even the most gossiping tongues had fallen silent. Mrs. Porter quietly dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The gambler's smirk had faded to a scowl as he watched his easy claim slipping away. "I stand here today as a free woman of 18 years, Millie declared, her voice steady and strong. "I have the papers to prove it. I am no one's property to claim or trade. I ask this court to recognize my right to choose my own path." As she finished speaking, Caleb's large hand came to rest on her shoulder, gentle but full of pride. Millie sat down, her heart pounding but her head held high. The courthouse remained silent as Judge Tilton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly thrown off balance by this turn of events. He peered down at the papers before him, then at the gambler's increasingly sour expression, weighing his decision. The gambler's boots clicked against the wooden floor as he strode forward, his face twisted with anger. He thrust the contract toward Judge Tilton, paper crackling in his tight grip. "This here's a binding agreement," he snarled, jabbing his finger at the document. "I paid good money for that girl's passage. The law's clear as day about debt and obligation." His voice rose as he turned to face the packed courtroom. "And this so-called Christian rancher?" He jabbed an accusing finger at Caleb. "He's nothing but a fraud, harboring a runaway minor. Where's the morality in that?" Whispers rippled through the crowd. Judge Tilton nodded, smoothing his vest with satisfaction. Indeed, the law does protect legitimate business arrangements. If the girl is underage, she cannot enter into marriage without proper, if it pleases the court. Mrs. Porter's clear voice cut through the murmuring as she rose from her seat. Her grey hair was neat beneath her Sunday bonnet, and her spine was straight as a ramrod as she approached the bench. "I have evidence that bears directly on this matter." She withdrew a thick envelope from her reticule, handling it with careful reverence. "These are the official records from St. Agnes Home for Children, Your Honor. They show Millie May's true birth date, witnessed and sealed by the Mother Superior herself." The judge's jowls quivered as he accepted the envelope. The gambler's face darkened as he watched Judge Tilton examine the documents within. "According to these records," the judge announced slowly, "the young woman known as Millie May turned 18 years of age 3 weeks ago." He cleared his throat. This would make her legally able to enter into binding contracts at the time she signed the marriage agreement. A gasp went up from the assembled townspeople. The gambler's face turned an ugly shade of purple. "That's impossible!" he spluttered. "She's nothing but a child. You can see that plain as day." "The records are official," Judge Tilton said stiffly, holding up the papers with their prominent church seal. "Properly witnessed and notarized." Caleb stood then, his massive frame drawing every eye in the courthouse. "Your Honor," he said, his deep voice steady and clear, "I wish to speak." The judge nodded reluctantly, and Caleb turned to face the crowd. His work-worn hands were steady at his sides, his shoulders squared beneath his best coat. "I don't claim Millie May by paper or by law," he declared. "Those things don't make a marriage in God's eyes." He looked down at Millie, his expression softening. "I choose her because she is more than enough in courage, in kindness, and in faith." The courthouse erupted in debate. Some people jumped to their feet, arguing loudly. Others nodded in approval. Through it all, Millie stared up at Caleb, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Order! Order in this court!" Judge Tilton banged his gavel repeatedly, his face flushed with frustration as the noise gradually subsided. The judge glared down at the papers before him, his mouth working as though he'd bitten into something sour. With the official records proving Millie's age, and the marriage contract properly signed when she was legally able to do so, he had no choice, given the evidence presented. He ground out, "This court finds no basis for the plaintiff's claim. The contract between Miss Millie May and Mr. Caleb Rourke stands as valid and binding. Case dismissed." The gambler slammed his hand against the railing. "This is robbery!" he shouted. "You'll regret this, all of you!" He stormed toward the door, his fancy boots thundering against the floorboards. The crowd parted to let him pass, and the courthouse door banged shut behind him. In the sudden quiet, people began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some women who had been the loudest gossips now stared at their hands in their laps. Others who had stood silent before offered small smiles of encouragement. Millie's fingers found Caleb's arm and clung there, tears spilling down her cheeks. He covered her hand with his own, steadying her as always. As people began to file out of the courthouse, many paused to speak to the couple. Old Mr. Peterson removed his hat, ducking his head. "Reckon we were wrong about some things," he mumbled. His wife nodded beside him, adding, "You're welcome at our social after church on Sunday." Mrs. Mitchell approached with her children in tow. "My young ones have something to say to Miss Millie," she said firmly. The children shuffled their feet before mumbling apologies for their previous teasing. Even some of the town's most prominent citizens stopped to offer awkward congratulations. With each interaction, Millie stood a little straighter, the burden of months of whispers and judgment gradually lifting from her shoulders. When they finally stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the winter sun was high and bright, making the snow sparkle like diamonds. A small crowd had gathered, but their faces now showed respect rather than scorn. Caleb helped Millie down the slippery steps, his strong arm never leaving her. At the wagon, he lifted her onto the seat with the same gentle care he'd shown that morning. But this time, when he looked at her, there was something new in his eyes, a warmth that made Millie's heart flutter. He climbed up beside her, gathering the reins in his massive hands. Millie sat close to him, no longer afraid of what people might say. "We are going home," Caleb told her softly, his words carrying all the weight of a sacred vow. As they drove away from the courthouse, leaving the town and its gossip behind, Millie felt a peace settle over her that she had never known before. The winter sun warmed her face, and Caleb's solid presence beside her promised a future she had never dared to dream of. The wagon wheels crunched through fresh snow as Caleb and Millie approached the ranch in the fading light. The afternoon's victory at the courthouse had left them both quiet, wrapped in thoughts as deep as the winter drifts. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth within. Mrs. Porter had kindly tended the fire while they were away. Caleb helped Millie down from the wagon, his massive hands gentle at her waist. She smiled up at him, no longer afraid of his touch. While he tended to the horses, Millie hurried inside to prepare their evening meal. The kitchen was cool, but the banked fire soon blazed to life under her careful attention. Millie moved about the familiar space, gathering ingredients for a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and the last of the autumn preserves. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, but not from fear. Something new fluttered in her chest, like hope taking wing. She heard Caleb's heavy boots on the porch, stamping off snow. The door opened, bringing a swirl of cold air and his towering presence. He hung his coat by the door, then paused, watching her work at the stove. The silence between them felt different now, expectant, but peaceful. "Smells good," he said softly, moving to wash his hands at the basin. Millie ducked her head, pleased. "Just simple fare," she replied, but her voice held new confidence. When she set the steaming bowls on the table, Caleb pulled out her chair. It was a small gesture, but it made her cheeks warm. They sat across from each other, the lamplight casting a gentle glow over the worn tablecloth. They ate quietly at first, but the silence was comfortable. Millie noticed how Caleb's eyes kept finding her face, as though seeing her anew. Her own gaze traced the strong lines of his jaw, the kindness in his expression that she had come to trust so deeply. After the dishes were cleared, Caleb remained at the table. His large hands were folded before him, and there was an intensity in his manner that made Millie's heart quicken. "Millie," he said finally, his deep voice gentle, "I need to ask you something important." She sat down across from him, hands clasped in her lap to still their trembling. "Yes." "What happened today at the courthouse? It proved the contract legal." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I don't want you staying here because of paper and ink. I want—" His voice grew softer. "I want you to stay as my wife, in truth, in choice. Tears sprang to Millie's eyes as Caleb continued. These past weeks, watching you face down gossip with courage, seeing your kindness, hearing your voice fill this empty house with song, it's shown me what God intended all along. He reached across the table, his massive hand open in invitation. Will you stay? Not as anyone's burden, but as my chosen bride? Millie's tears spilled over as she placed her small hand in his. Yes, she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. Yes, I'll stay. Caleb's fingers closed carefully around hers. He stood, drawing her gently to her feet. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. I promise you this. You'll never be treated as less than precious in this house. Not by me, not by anyone. Millie looked up at him through tear-bright eyes. I never dreamed anyone would want me. She admitted softly. Not for myself. I want you, Caleb said simply, just as you are. He bent down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Millie lifted her face to his, and their lips met in a first kiss that was gentle as a prayer. His hand cradled her cheek as though she were made of finest china, and her fingers curled into the rough fabric of his shirt. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. Caleb pressed his forehead to hers for a moment, then straightened. Shall we pray? He asked softly. Millie nodded, and they knelt together beside the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows as Caleb's deep voice rose in thanks. Lord, you turned our shame to blessing. He prayed. You brought light from darkness and joy from sorrow. Thank you for showing us your path, even when we couldn't see it clearly. Thank you for giving me a home. Millie added softly, her voice thick with emotion. Not just a place to stay, but a true home. They remained kneeling together, hands clasped, until the last light faded outside. When they finally rose, Caleb noticed the storm had cleared. He opened the door, and Millie joined him in the doorway. The winter sky stretched above them, vast and clear, with stars scattered like diamonds across black velvet. The snow reflected their light, making the whole world seem to glow with possibility. Caleb's arm settled around Millie's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth. The ranch spread before them, peaceful under its blanket of snow. The barn, the corrals, the distant pastures, all of it felt different now. No longer a place of loneliness, but a promise of future joy. I'm home, Millie whispered, watching her breath mist in the cold air. Caleb's arm tightened gently around her. So am I, he answered. They stood together in the doorway, watching the stars wheel overhead. The journey that had brought them here, through ridicule and doubt, through courage and faith, had forged something stronger than any paper contract could bind. It had created a family, chosen and cherished, blessed by heaven itself. In the distance, a coyote called, its voice rising clear and wild in the winter night. But inside the ranch house, all was warm and still, filled with the quiet certainty of love finally found. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the snow-covered ranch. Caleb rose early, as always, but this morning his steps held new lightness. Through the kitchen window, he watched Millie moving about, already dressed and humming as she stoked the stove fire. After a hearty breakfast of flapjacks and coffee, Caleb headed to the barn to saddle his horse. The familiar routine felt different somehow, richer, more purposeful. He heard Millie's voice drifting from the chicken coop, speaking softly to the hens as she gathered eggs. Her confidence showed in every movement, no longer tentative or apologetic. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern hills when the first neighbors rode past. Instead of averting their eyes or whispering behind their hands, they offered respectful nods. One rancher even tipped his hat to Millie, calling out, "Fine morning, ain't it?" Around midday, Mrs. Porter's wagon rattled up the snow-packed drive. She climbed down carrying a heavy basket filled with preserved peaches and apple butter. "Welcome home proper, Mrs. Rourke," she said warmly, embracing Millie. Millie's face lit up at the name, her cheeks pink with pleasure. "Thank you, Mrs. Porter. Won't you stay for coffee?" After Mrs. Porter's visit, Caleb and Millie headed out to mend a stretch of fence damaged by the recent storms. Millie held the wire steady while Caleb hammered posts, their teamwork growing smoother with each repair. When Millie tangled herself in a length of wire, Caleb's deep chuckle joined her embarrassed giggle. "Reckon we're both learning," he said, carefully unwinding her. As evening approached, neighbors began arriving for the prayer circle, something Caleb's ranch hadn't hosted in years. The front room filled with the scent of coffee and the murmur of friendly voices. Lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls as everyone settled in with their Bibles. When it came time for hymns, Millie's sweet voice rose clear and true, singing the songs she'd learned in the orphanage. The familiar melodies took on new meaning here, surrounded by friendship instead of loneliness. Other voices joined in, filling the ranch house with harmony. Caleb sat in his father's old chair, watching his wife in the lamplight. Her face glowed with joy as she sang, and he marveled at how such strength and grace had found its way to his door. When they all knelt for evening prayers, his large hand found hers naturally. Outside, the winter wind piled snow against the fence posts and barn walls, but inside, the ranch house glowed with warmth and welcome. Laughter and prayer mingled with the crackle of the hearth fire, transforming the once quiet home into a sanctuary of joy. Weeks melted into spring, the Colorado sun warming frozen ground into mud and promise. One bright morning, Caleb helped Millie into their wagon for the weekly trip to town. The wooden wheels splashed through puddles left by thawing snow, marking their progress down the rutted road. As they approached the town's main street, Millie noticed the difference immediately. Where once sidewalks had cleared at their approach, now townspeople waved and called out greetings. The mercantile owner tipped his hat, and Mrs. Porter's sewing circle ladies smiled warmly from their bench. "Morning, Rourkes," called the blacksmith, his hammer pausing mid-strike. "Heard your north fence held through the last storm." Caleb nodded, his chest swelling with quiet pride. The gambler's empty chair outside the saloon gathered dust. He'd fled weeks ago, leaving only bitter memories. Through the courthouse windows, they glimpsed officials conducting their inquiry into Judge Tilton's dealings. The sound of his gavel no longer echoed with corruption. While Caleb loaded supplies, Millie ventured into the mercantile. Children who had once jeered now gathered around her, begging to hear about the new foal on the ranch. She laughed, sharing stories of its wobbly legs and describing how Caleb had helped deliver it during the last snow. "Can we visit sometime, Mrs. Rourke?" asked a freckled girl who'd once mocked Millie's size. "I reckon you can," Millie answered, her smile genuine and free. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they drove home, their wagon heavy with supplies and lighter hearts. Fields glistened with meltwater, promising green grass soon. Caleb's strong hands guided the horses, while Millie hummed her favorite hymn. That evening, they shared a simple supper of beef stew and fresh bread. Steam rose from their bowls as they bowed heads in thanks. Afterward, they settled onto the porch, watching purple shadows creep across the land. Caleb's arm slipped around Millie's shoulders, drawing her close against the evening chill. "I prayed for a wife with a brave heart," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "God gave me more than I asked." Millie nestled against his broad chest, remembering the frightened girl who'd stepped off that train months ago. "And he gave me a home," she whispered. Their ranch house glowed golden in the twilight, lamplight spilling from windows onto melting snow. Against the darkening sky, it stood as a beacon, Not just of warmth and shelter, but of faith rewarded and dignity restored. Love had transformed their lonely lives into something greater than either had dared to dream. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.